As someone who went to college nearly 20 years ago, that hurt me a little bit to say. I wish I had known this then. Hello and welcome to the Durham Talents channel. My name is Jesse Durham. For today's installation of our book review series, this is going to be number 22, part 5 of the book, pages 75 through 81. Nelson is addressing the value of college, but in a really particular way, the monetary value of college. So while we will start out a little bit reviewing the philosophical aspects that are brought up about pursuing further education, he's really looking at this college aspect of implementing infinite banking in a completely different way than what is done conventionally concerning college. It's a monetary assessment of the college experience and some alternatives that one could consider. So let's start on page 75 with a big assumption. The assumption is that a college degree will allow you to earn whatever X amount more than if you didn't have that degree. I mean, that's what I can remember from school for sure, was that if you are not going to go into the military, college was the answer. There was no push, there was no promotion, there was no insight, there was no inspiration or encouragement to even look at being self-employed or entrepreneurial. And in fact, having been both a student in a government school system and a teacher now, looking back, it really is an interesting dynamic that you're seeing played out, where a lot of individuals, a lot of folks with initiative in school that could have even have been disruptive are some of the best business owners that I know today. So interesting thought right there. But the assumption in general is that you'll earn more with a college degree than without one. Now, a quick interjection here could be concerning qualified plans. For example, the 529 plan. The government, of course, is getting into the scene by offering a qualified plan for the purpose, and there are lots of restrictions, and it's worth looking into. We won't do too deep of a dive right here into that, but these qualified plans that are even specifically for pursuing further education are introduced, and financial professionals approach college from a needs-based selling perspective. Well, your child is going to need this amount for college. Maybe, maybe not. And then, of course, when it comes to those qualified plans, is there the same flexibility that you will find with infinite banking? I'll let you decide that. Now, another worthy mention here in this arena is going to be the financial gurus that are out there. So the government has its propaganda, the financial institutions have their propaganda, and even a Dave Ramsey will go out and say, we'll put X amount into college for the kids. I mean, it's one of the baby steps that he has. After the baby emergency fund and the debt snowball, and then the emergency fund, and then the contribution towards 15% towards your retirement, college comes next, and then the house mortgage. So it's an actual step in a lot of people's approach to finances. Now, on the other side of the spectrum, but from the same general arena, meaning individuals that are just out there in the world that are putting out some really interesting information, I think, are folks like John Stossel or folks like Mike Rowe. I would really encourage you to listen to interviews from John Stossel, where he's looking at charter schools, private schools, public schools, the college education. Really neat things that he's documenting and filming and putting out for folks. It'll give perspective, I believe. And then Mike Rowe, who's so very famous for Dirty Jobs, just a real blue-collared fellow who's brought a lot of attention to the trades, for example, and how schools used to have trades being taught in them, whether it was metal or fabrication or wood shop or mechanicking, whatever the case might be. There were those types of trades even being taught at the high school level, let alone later on in furthered education. So I wanted to mention those because I found them valuable in my own experience. Now, I will go ahead and say for myself that a college degree is not necessarily equal to education. And I'll pose you with the question so that you could consider your own answer. Do you know, and this is right from the book, do you know someone who has a college degree, but you don't view them as an educated person, perhaps even in the field that they have their degree in? Now, personally, I'll even go ahead and mention a little bit about my own background, is that I went to government schooling all my life, K through 12, went and pursued a 4-year degree myself, and then several years after having my bachelor's degree and pursuing a couple of different fields professionally, I came back and taught high school Spanish in a government school. So I've been both student and teacher, and it's given me a very interesting perspective. And now my wife and I homeschool all 3 of our children, which really just rounds off our experience around education. But for me, I had a real financial, personal growth, educational renaissance in 2015. And not to say that discovering infinite banking was no small part of that renaissance. It wasn't everything. I was exposed to business. I was exposed to entrepreneurship. I was exposed to personal growth and development. I actually looked at things like even my parenting and my marriage and other aspects of my life that are very important to me as fields where I could and should and did from myself continue to pursue an education in those areas to better myself, to rethink my thinking, to borrow a principle from Nelson. Now, Nelson does mention some names in this section of the book. One is Dr. Herbert Rotfield, and he illustrates some observations that Dr. Rotfield noted, one of which was that students want certifications, credits. They're trying to check the box, credentials. Another is that school is looked as something that you have to endure. And again, I'll go back here to my own experience. A lot of the best business owners, local business owners that I know, didn't really enjoy school. And I'm not saying that there's not something still to push back against, that there's value to push back against our unwillingness initially to better ourselves. I still think that everyone has their gifts and their talents and their abilities, and they even probably want to dig deeper there, which then can compel them to pursue business. And at the same time, I think that there's value in forcing ourselves to some measure to experience educating ourselves in other areas, just for exposure's sake, if nothing else. I think of a saying that I heard years ago that I've adopted. When a fellow, I heard him say this, when a fellow was invited to see some information or invited to a meeting or invited to a presentation or asked to come take a look at something, he always said yes. Because he said to me, he said, worst case scenario, I learned something. That's it. And part of what he might learn is about something that he's going to say no to. And that's okay. He learned something. Better case scenario, learns something and wants to do something about it. Because again, you said yes, even though it took time or maybe even some discomfort, whatever the case might be. So food for thought there. But school in general is endured. And at the behest of others, be that parents, be that other childhood influences, guidance counselors at schools. I know there are some great people out there. Teachers, I love you. It's an unsung profession that we've pursued, educating. But there are those cases that I've personally experienced with people in my circle where there was a bad influence, where they were being pushed in a direction that they didn't need to go, shouldn't have gone, etc. Another observation from Dr. Rotfield was that there's no real value given to the learning itself. You're just trying to check the box. You're just trying to get the certificate or the certification, whatever the case might be. Now, business educators in particular, he says, should answer a very sincere and obvious question, which is, well, if someone's going to particularly be teaching in business, were they ever a business owner? And then if they were a business owner, were they a successful business owner? Because 95%, I've heard it, of businesses go under. Now, here's a great point for me to jump in and say, well, it's really hard for a business to go out of business while it has capital. So there's something to be said there. And obviously, that's a big connecting dot with infinite banking. Having unfettered contractual access to a compounding pool of capital that you can privately, in a tax-free manner, utilize for running, managing a business, it's a beautiful thing. But was this teacher in business, and were they successful in business? Two good questions to ask. These were some observations here. And I've mentioned something that I've experienced in my own life when talking about trying to go through the program, trying to climb the ladder in different professions that I've had. When I was in college, I double majored. When I was in law enforcement, I went and got my, after getting my basic law enforcement certificate just to get a job, then I went and pursued continued education and got a basic certificate. I got an intermediate certificate. I was going up the ladder. I was following the protocol. I was actually looking to get better. I actually was showing up to classes, spending weeks at a time, money, effort, etc., into honing my skills, improving my abilities, adding to my acumen and knowledge and my repertoire of what I could bring to bear to be of service to people. But there's a lot of structure out there that's just putting that ladder for the paperwork of it. Do you know what I mean? So these are some observations from Dr. Rotfield that I could understand and that I can relate to. And then in education, I taught high school Spanish because I had actually become very proficient, very well traveled, very well experienced in Spanish, bilingual. And I was in a position to be able to teach others because I had successfully done it. Había aprendido cómo hablar español. Okay? So worthwhile questions to ask about people that you're going to learn anything from. Have they done it, and did they do it well? Worthwhile. Very worthwhile. Now, another person that's mentioned by name here is the IBM Chief Executive, Louis V. Gerstner, Jr. And something that Gerstner says is that business education and vocational schools, meaning skill-based, like we mentioned earlier, are not the same. So here's let me jump in and I'll give you a quote from Gerstner here in a second, but I was having a great interview just the other day. You can actually check it out in my interview series with Tom Suvansri. Tom's father was a doctor, and he was talking about what a great doctor his father was, what an impact he had in the community. People respected him, but he wasn't a great businessman. And that's so very true for so many people. They're great in their skill, and their skill is being brought to the market via a business. And maybe they're really good at what it is that they're doing, but they're not necessarily rehearsed, experienced, have insights, or doing well as a business. Managing a business, running a business, growing and scaling a business, etc. Those are two different things. It's one thing to learn a trade, to become a farrier. It's one thing to learn how to be a good farrier than it is to run a farrier business. Do you follow me in that? So very interesting right there. And then a quote from Gerstner is, what is killing us is having to read and compute and communicate, and to think. Do you follow me on that? He's talking about to read, to think. And then he follows up on that and talks about how problems actually come when teachers quit thinking. We're just trying to grade papers. We're just trying to maintain the status quo of status or rates or reviews, government support, funding. Okay? I've experienced these things. So people are not taught how to read so very well nowadays. People are not taught how to think, not what to think, right? Not what to think, but how to go about thinking. And again, I'll reference that principle from Nelson, his fifth one, rethink your thinking. Rethink your thinking. That's so big, that's so deep, it's so profound. All right, on page 76, it's mentioned that a degree is becoming more extensive. Again, when I read that, I thought of John Stossel. I encourage you to check out John Stossel and what he's documented on the cost of a college education going up, especially if you're like me, if you have children, and that might be an option for them. So I'm not trying to deride further education, even in college or universities. It's an option that's on the table. It's not, I would say, mandatory, or at least it's not in my house, for my home, my family, but it is an option on the table. I'm not trying to toss the baby out with the bathwater. I'm not trying to completely deride a college education, but the cost is going up, and I'm saying that we should account for that. What if 10 years from now, 20 years from now, when our children and grandchildren are ready to pursue that education or anything else, and again, we're going to come to this, we're going to connect some more dots on infinite banking in particular, some practical aspects here in a second. We want to position ourselves to be able to account for that rising cost of the education. Now here's a quote from Nelson. Nelson said, "When the perceived value of anything has no real basis, a return to reality is inevitable." Meaning, if because of government involvement it becomes prohibitive or just onerous to pursue an education, and folks don't go that route near as much anymore, which thankfully, I believe we have seen a bit of a renaissance when it comes to folks considering the military or pursuing trades or entrepreneurship instead of the college route. I mean, you can talk with so many high schoolers and young adults nowadays who are already in a business, maybe not even their first business. It's incredible. So that return to reality reminds me of the emperor's new clothes. That's just the visual that comes to my mind, where the emperor is saying, "Oh, look at my magnificent clothes." But the reality is that there weren't any magnificent clothes. And eventually, reality is going to be brought back around. Well, historically, World War II, the GI Bill, everything in that time where folks that are returning from the war, young men, are anticipated to perhaps wreck the economy. The GI Bill is introduced. And again, I work with lots of clients right now. I've got clients, they're actively serving in the military. I've got clients that have served in the military. Much respect to you. Again, we're just talking some history right here. The GI Bill was introduced because the thinking was that, well, the economy is going to wreck when we've got all these working age men just coming back and flooding into the system, so to speak. We've got to do something with these servicemen, was the mentality. And government does what government does. Of course, there's this top-down thinking and approach where the idea of everybody deserves a college education begin to get traction. Everybody deserves this college education, which of course then means that college, much like, say, pharmaceuticals and some other particulars where the government has really intervened or interposed into the free market, the cost has even outpaced inflation. So there's general inflation. There's an inflated money supply. So there's a perceived risen cost in goods. For this, just time check yourself by asking, what did a candy bar cost 50 years ago? What did it cost 5 years ago? What does it cost today? What might it cost 5 years from now, 50 years from now? General inflation. But these places where government honestly is interjecting itself into the marketplace, the rise in cost is even outpacing inflation. So it's a big thing to account for. I talk very often about inflation and how implementing infinite banking with depreciating dollars today by paying premiums, you're creating multiples of those dollars guaranteed in the future for yourself. So that in and of itself, that relationship of premium dollars creating multiples of themselves in the future, expressed in cash values and dividends as well, and then the death benefit itself, of course. That's a great hedge against inflation in general. But on top of that, college that cost that's outpaced inflation merits its own discussion, and that's why we're having this installation in the book review series, of course. So because of that government interference, we're seeing that college has also increased in cost multiples of what it was just years prior. Now, I love the example that's given here. This is still on page 76, excuse me. This is still on page 76, this example that's given, where college education and how it's risen in cost is put up against the personal computer and the personal computer's trajectory over time in the marketplace. So here I'm a millennial, so for me, I can remember in the beginning where computers were these high-level building-size apparatus that was for scientists and NASA and all this other stuff, right? And then we had, do you remember the Oregon Trail game? If you remember that game, you're my people. Remember the Oregon Trail? You go to ford the river and you die. So funny. And now we have these computers that are just incredible, and the cost is not what it was. That relationship monetarily is so very different because of the minimal amount of government influence in the evolution of, I've got one here, I've got my phone right behind me, completely different trajectory. So that's a very real world example of monetary value, where there's not so much government influence in what the free market can bring to bear. Okay, so let's make a transition, because so far I've been talking about the observations that Nelson is introducing to us to consider, and that's to set the stage for us to now talk about the monetary value that we want to consider traditionally comparing pursuing a college degree versus an example that he gives. So a college degree versus IBC. Now, again, let me say right here real quick, we don't have to do a versus. You can use infinite banking for college. Do you hear me? Nelson's getting ready to show a different type of example, monetary example only. And I've done a video talking about college. I need to make sure to put that in the show notes below. But I've addressed paying for, financing a college education with a private banking system. So you can do that. So you don't have to do this versus scenario like we're getting ready to do. It's an and option, all right? You can do infinite banking and college. You can do infinite banking for college. Now, obviously, if you're implementing infinite banking and college is only 4 years of your life, 8 years of your life, then infinite banking keeps going. It's not just consolidated or limited to being utilized for paying for a college education, but it certainly can do that. At the end of the day, When you realize that conventionally dollars typically do one thing and then they're gone. Either we've borrowed somebody else's money on their terms and conditions after filling out their paperwork, providing them with collateral to pay them interest on that, promising them our future abilities, our future endeavors. Or we've amassed cash that we're going to liquidate, and then those dollars quit working for us, forever for us, forever. We liquidate those cash dollars and they stop working for us. Well, when you're using infinite banking for college, to pay for college, to finance college, because everything is finance, traditionally that's credit and cash. The compounding way with infinite banking is you put that dollar into the policy first. It grows you a death benefit. It grows you a cash value. It can earn you a dividend. You can access tax-free. It's private. It's easy to manage. It is that hedge against inflation like we've already discussed. And so many other attributes are inherent in that way of financing by putting money there first. And then, of course, you still have unfettered access to a compounding pool of capital to go out and pay for this semester's college experience, this year of college, or for your children, or for your grandchildren. Now let's go back to the versus scenario. So the college degree versus infinite banking. Now Nelson's asking us, you decide on the value of these two different scenarios. So let's not get bogged down in the numbers. And in fact, I'm not really going to even mention the numbers. I don't plan to mention any of these numbers. I'd like you to, this book review is to encourage you to get back in the book and then to listen to this feedback from me from having gone through the book many times and coaching people on how to implement infinite banking. I want to hit some high points. So in Nelson's example, he's not showing a significant capitalization that takes place over a long time. That's not what he shows. He's actually only showing that you could capitalize the policy for 4 years and then X, Y, and Z happen. So for what I'm mentioning here, Nelson's number one principle is think long range. So what he's showing you right there is a very conservative approach to the power of infinite banking, even if you only capitalize for 4 years, which is not for the long range. That's probably just capitalizing for this one use. Now, it's going to be able to do more than just that, but that's not you capitalizing. And that does bring us to his second principle, which is don't be afraid to capitalize. So principle number 2 is you should actively be capitalizing long range. So those two principles build on top of each other. So there's no substantial capitalization for a long period shown in this example. There's no IBC application over the lifetime. It's just what if you use this as a monetary replacement for what a college degree could or would do for you. And it's displaying just the policy performance is what I'm showing here. So a policy does what a policy does. You pay a premium dollar into a properly, specifically structured policy with a mutual company that pays a dividend. That premium dollar is going to buy you death benefit, it's going to build cash value, and can earn you a dividend. That's what it's going to do. You can have guaranteed growth just by owning the policy, as if you were virtually sitting it on a shelf. Just by paying premium dollars, that's what's going to happen. Now, if you bank with that policy, meaning you access capital, you pay for what it was that you were going to pay for anyway, and then you pay that back plus interest like you would have to a bank. You're your own banker in this scenario. It's going to be great. But Nelson's just limiting this example to the college scenario of only capitalizing 4 years and then using it for that. Before we go further, let me point that out. Now, he does show a retirement or passive income. Again, we're moving away from the retirement language and talking more in terms of passive income for those of us that have sincerely adopted infinite banking. Retirement. We don't want to go backwards. Now, passive income, double check. Absolutely. Yes. And then Nelson does point out that there's a significant death benefit. So in what scenario where let's use a high yield savings account. I went through this mental scenario with a client, someone who's actually had a policy for right at a year right now, and they're still working through some mental hurdles, and that's okay. That's why I'm mentioning it here. I still had a client yesterday. We were talking about the policy that she has on her son. She's looking at another policy for herself. And the thinking was still there to make her want to ask me, well, Jesse, what makes this different again than a high yield savings account? And it's a good question. It's a worthwhile question. Meaning, and she was asking me, well, what's going to be the difference over the next 12 months? Because if I put X amount of money over the next 12 months into a savings account, I'm going to have access to all of that. All of that's going to be accessible, liquid. And if I pay that into a policy, I'm going to have access to less than 100%. And that's true, and that's accurate. So let's walk that scenario out with what I was mentioning there about the death benefit. Let's play a worst case scenario. And we don't have to just stop there, and I'm not saying that this is the only thing that can be said here. There's a lot that could be said here. But let's play a worst case scenario. What's the worst case scenario that you start saving for college, and you only get 1 year into saving for your child before you graduate, before you pass on? Well, with a savings account, if you don't have to go through probate and all these other different things, there's just going to be what's in the savings account. Whereas if that money had been paid as premium to a policy, there's going to be a much, much, much greater, an exponentially greater death benefit that's going to be paid. And that's the worst case scenario. And the more likely, and I'll admit, yes, the more likely scenario is that you're going to live and that you would experience a loss of liquidity. Not a loss of value, but a loss of liquidity in the first year, or 2 years, or 3 years, or 4 years, or beyond, in a policy than you would in a savings account. And again, I don't want to bog down too much right here. There are lots of other things to consider. Are you taxed on the interest that you earn in a high yield savings account? Yes. And so many other things. Could you be sued for what's there? Yes. So all these aspects are worthwhile, but I'm not trying to dig deep here in the moment just yet. But what Nash is saying is that even with this conservative approach to looking at infinite banking as an alternative to the monetary value of a college degree, you're getting a death benefit, and it's not taking a significant length of time. We're not taking a long-range approach to this. You can receive passive income from an infinite banking approach. Let's keep going. Now, this is a fairly aggressive base and PUA split also. And it's not including any extra PUA. So again, don't get bogged down in the numbers. Nelson said if he were rewriting the book before he passed, he wouldn't have included the illustrations, but they're there and they are useful. But if you're able enough to see that $20,000 premium, and now I'm mentioning numbers, I said I wouldn't, $20,000 premium, there's a net cash value of $13,203. Well, that's a significant cash value. So it's a pretty aggressive build on a policy. It could be more aggressive, could be less aggressive. Everybody should have a policy specifically built for them based on their cash flow, their plans, their goals, their understanding of infinite banking, how it's playing into their overall plan. But this, for its illustrative purposes, is saying that there's a significant amount of cash value relative to the total amount of premium that's paid that is available for financing this college education. Now, as you go back through this section, I hope you really hone in on the part where Nelson's showing us that learning about privatized banking is not going to happen from a conventional educational environment. It's not going to happen. You know, infinite banking is really getting out there now, but I still also feel like we've just begun. And Nelson started it all, and I want to honor that and how I do that. But myself and folks like me are spreading the word that you can become your own banker. But I didn't grow up hearing this, knowing this, stepping in on this as a paradigm from folks that I went to school with or went to church with or worked with or my parents or any other influences growing up. This was something that I was introduced to, thankfully, by a friend. And that's very likely how you've come across infinite banking, that somebody pointed you towards it, but not from a commercial, conventional education background. And that's what I'm definitely looking to change. And that's the intent behind the podcast and the YouTube channel and everything that I'm doing with the Durham Talents, is that for me and my family, we're living and leaving a lasting legacy. And then we're encouraging other people to do just that. People like you that are watching and listening to a book review on this Becoming Your Own Banker book. So the thing that I was trying to point out from, say, a professor or a teacher is that they're going to say what Nelson typically says folks will say about whole life insurance, which is that it's a horrible place to put money. It's got a bad rate of return. If you do have it, the insurance company is going to keep your cash value and only pay the death benefit to your family when you die, and lots of other things. And on that point, again, Nelson says most people's understanding of whole life insurance is based off of someone else's misunderstanding of whole life insurance. So to address myths, mysteries, and misconceptions around infinite banking and whole life insurance, I've got a whole series on my channel that I would encourage you to check out. I will put the link to that particular series, that playlist, in the show notes below. Myths, mysteries, and misconceptions. Check it out. So because a professor would be likely to say, well, whole life insurance is a very poor place to put money, your unlearning of things that you have learned is going to be so important. And again, that goes back to Nelson's principle, rethink your thinking. Another highlight is training and thinking are not the same. I'm a big proponent of training. Because of my law enforcement background, I've adopted the philosophy that you, in a stressful situation, will resort to your lowest level of training, the things that you can do without having to think about them. Muscle memory. Have you heard about this? Okay. So training can help you develop some good habits. However, thinking that can be done in a calm environment is something completely different. And on that thought, I'll just give you one practical thing that I found to be terribly helpful ever since I implemented it. I can remember Zig Ziglar. If you've not seen anything from Zig Ziglar, check him out. Read behind him, watched his stuff. Beautiful fellow. He talked about taking walks, ambles, really. Go ambling. Seemingly purposeless walking, not an exercise walk, not a walk for exercise, but a slow, thoughtful walk. And both to get some steps in, but also to have some built-in thinking time in my day. When I eat a meal, I typically try to walk for 10 minutes without distractions, typically. Now, sometimes I will also use that time to make phone calls and stay connected with people. And if I've thought about somebody, I'm going to reach out to them and I'm going to pour into them. Or sometimes I need pouring into, and I call somebody and they're a big help to me. But those 10-minute walks for thinking, because thinking and training are different. That's a big highlight from this section. And then ultimately, higher education should be, and I encourage it to be for you, a lifelong pursuit. Was it Ray Kroc that said, if you are green, you're growing. If you're ripe, you're rotten? Higher education should be a lifelong pursuit. Now, it's on 77, before Nelson gets to the illustrations, that he encourages that we teach Susie about banking. And he goes through the example of it being less expensive. There's not going to be a need for a retirement plan or dependency upon government programs like Social Security. Susie can start a business having this fleet of rentable cars to her peers, and she'll create a beautiful income for herself in addition to whether she pursues a college education or not. So remember that everything is financed. You can do infinite banking for and with and on top of whatever it is that you are going to do or pursue or build or grow in a career or business at the same time. Infinite banking is the way to do those things. Pursue a career, build a business, make an investment, go to college, whatever the case may be. And by doing infinite banking, it just opens up a world of financing opportunities because, again, everything is financed and you can be your own banker in all of those aspects. So this has been an absolute pleasure for me to go over the college portion of Nelson's book. Again, I would encourage you to get in Nelson's book to be able to connect with me and have a conversation about how you could level up what it is that you're already doing or that you want to do. You can find me at durhamtalents.com. My encouragement is to live and leave a lasting legacy. Hope you have a great day. Take care. And I'll pose you with the question, which just really to be able to connect with me and have a conversation about how